My name is Olmo van den Akker, and I'll be talking to you about one of my favorite topics, pre-registration. And let me first introduce myself a bit more. So my name is Olmo van den Akker, like I said, and I'll be talking about pre-registration because it is a topic I've been diving into quite extensively. So I'm a meta scientist, and that means I'm studying scientific processes. And well, pre-registration is one of such processes. And I did a PhD about this topic at Tilburg University. There's a meta research center there where I did this. And we did a lot of studies about whether pre-registration is effective. So does it actually achieve its goals, yes or no? During this PhD, I also created two pre-registration templates. So these are basically uh, lists of questions that you can use for if you want to pre-register a specific study. So we developed two with a group of people. One was for secondary data analysis. So these are studies that you do based on existing data, for example, from a database or a registry. So you're not collecting your own data. And also a template for systematic reviews, which you're probably all familiar with. And well, during my time as a PhD student, I also, and by the way, I'm still doing this. I've many discussions with the community, different stakeholders about how to implement pre-registration in psychology, but also in other sciences. So that's a bit about me, and I want to move a bit to you. So throughout this presentation, there are several moments where I want to ask you a question, where you can provide some input. I'm doing that with Menti. So you might be familiar with this, but you basically just click or you just go to menti.com and you fill out the code. And then you will get some questions that you can answer and that we can talk about in this session. So please do so. You can do it also on your mobile phone. You can do this on your laptop or a secondary device. Everything's possible. This is the code. And hopefully you have done that. If not, the code is 26193127. And you should now see a map where you can indicate where you study or where you work. So this is just to get an idea about where everybody's from. So hopefully I'll see some dots popping up. So I forgot to say, but I'm actually based in Berlin at the moment. So I'm also affiliated with the Quest Center for Responsible Research, which is also hosting this Love Methods Week. But I'm originally originally from Amsterdam in the Netherlands, so pretty close by. And I can see that also on the map here that most people are from Europe. Maybe there will be some people from farther away. I don't expect many people from the United States or Asia just because of the time difference. But yeah, Germany seems to be a bit the epicenter. So thanks for sharing that with me, just to get you an idea. Also, I'd like to know what fields you work in. Like I said, I'm a meta scientist, so I'm basically looking at science in all kinds of different fields, but mainly in psychology. So that's also where my educational background is in, and where pre-registration is also getting more and more popular, I think. And yeah, indeed, psychology is also has the biggest font size here, so that kind of tracks, I guess. I also see some more physical things, sports science, health fields. Pre-registration is also big in health. So there it's actually called registration. And that has some historical roots with it, which I will talk about in a minute. It's good that you all have found the Menti. That's nice. So clearly epidemiology and psychology are the biggest ones here. And that makes sense because I think pre-registration/registration is indeed biggest in those area, maybe even most relevant, but we can discuss about this maybe later at the end where the Q&A is, when the Q&A is. Then a question about your experiences with pre-registration. So this also includes registration if you're from more health-related fields, just to give me an idea of what I'm working with, basically. I think I'm in the 5+ category, which is not surprising, I think. Basically, every study that has an hypothesis, I will pre-register that. I did so from the start. But not every study is really as relevant to pre-register, so maybe I can also go into that a bit later. Right, so most people have not pre-registered a study yet, or have maybe done one, so that's good to know. So there's not that much experience with pre-registration. It is also more an up and coming thing in a lot of fields, in a lot of universities, so that also kind of makes sense. Yeah, so thanks for providing this information. Final question before I go into the nitty-gritty is, what do you see as good reasons to pre-register studies? So what are your intuitions here? If you've done a pre-registration already, why did you do that? Was it a selfish reason? Was it maybe a communal reason? Was it a scientific reason? I'd like to hear your thoughts. Doesn't have to be full sentences, can just be keywords like transparency, for example. If you're unsure, you can also specify that. Okay, not sure. Well, hopefully this talk will give you some ideas about why it is a good idea, or maybe not a good idea in all situations. So I see mainly transparency, and this is indeed one of the key reasons for pre-registration, because you basically make your research plan transparent to others, and they can then see what you planned, and then also what you actually did in the publication, and then it's easier for people to basically interpret what you did, your research study. So that kind of tracks. So thank you for that. Let's go back to the slides. Hope this goes smoothly. I think it does. So just a short agenda for the rest of the session. First, we're going to dive into a bit into the why. So I will do this, the why of pre-registration. So why would you do it? I will do this with using a brief history in biomedicine and in psychology and more in social sciences. And then we'll move on to how. So what are the good ways to pre-register? And how can you track whether you're doing it well or whether a field is doing it well? So we'll dive into the logistics of pre-registration, so a bit more the infrastructure surrounding it. We'll do that together, again, with a mentee. Then I'll talk a bit about some empirical evidence that's out there, some meta-science about how effective pre-registration actually is at the moment. And then at the end, we'll have room for questions from your side. This can be all kinds of questions, can be conceptual about pre-registration as a concept, could be also tailored to your own specific situation. So feel free to use this in any way you like. So what is pre-registration? That's, I think, a good starting point. At the bottom, you see a definition that I like quite a lot, also because it's quite broad. So it is basically that you specify the research design, your hypotheses, and the statistical analysis plan or qualitative analysis plan before you actually observe the outcomes of a study. So at the top left, you can see this more visually, where there's a research timeline, so to say. And well, first you design a study based on what you want to know. Then comes the point of pre-registration. So you basically pre-register this design, your research plan. And only after you did that, then you collect the data, analyze the data, and publish your results. So this is where it's located in the timeline. And the top right is a depiction of that pre-registration really gaining popularity. So you see kind of an exponential growth curve. It's a bit outdated data this. It goes until 2022, where there were 120,000 registrations on the Open Science Framework, which is a big repository of where you can drop your registrations if you have them. But I think it's definitely over 200,000 point at the moment. So there's hundreds and thousands of pre-registrations at the moment, and you can just inspect and check out. So it's really gaining traction. So why is this the case? Why is it becoming so popular in the last decade, so to say? Well, one reason is publication bias, which is that a lot of published findings are positive findings where the researchers find an effect, while a lot of studies where they did not find an effect are maybe put in the file drawer or are not submitted to a journal or are not accepted by a journal. And this picture is basically an illustration of publication bias in the wild. I found this at a conference, and the blue bars indicate studies that were published, and the red bars indicate studies that were not published. And you can see that the red ones typically have a null effect, so they didn't find an effect, but the blue ones did. So that is exactly what we mean by publication bias. That there's an overrepresentation of positive results in the literature. And how does pre-registration help with this? It basically helps identify the red studies. So if these are not published, how would you be able to track those? How would you know that these exist in the first place? Well, if there is a research plan online somewhere, then you can still know that these are studies that are being carried out or have been carried out in the past. So you are able to maybe look at the results anyway on clinicaltrials.gov, for example, which is another pre-registration repository for health research. So you can maybe then get a better idea of the overall evidence. And you can not only see the positive things, but also the negative things. So it gives a more balanced picture if you include the pre-registered results. Just mentioned clinicaltrials.gov, which is a really important website where you can register your clinical trials. Actually, for clinical trials, it has been mandated that you register these because the impact of these is so big that they thought, okay, we need to see all of the studies that are being carried out. So you have to register those on that website. There's also an European variant, which is called clinicaltrialsregister.eu, where if you're funded by an EU agency or affiliated with a European university, you can drop your registrations there. So that's the biomedicine side of things. So in psychology, there was actually another reason why pre-registration became popular, and that has to do with false positives and questionable research practices. So I want to illustrate with this example. So this woman in the picture, she has a pretty powerful pose and illustrating the phenomenon that was called power posing. So that means if you take such a strong pose, this can also be, for example, if you raise your hands, like showing your muscles, that's also a powerful pose. So if you do that, the idea was that you gain more confidence, that you are more assertive, and that it also translates to behaviors. So there were some studies that showed this, but then when they became a bit skeptical of this phenomenon, so they did larger studies, more qualitatively better studies basically, and they found that this phenomenon actually did not exist after all. So there was a false positive, and this was not the only thing that has happened to. There's many examples in psychology that this took place, which was led to a so-called replication crisis, which you probably have heard of. So how does pre-registration help with this? I'd like to show you this empirical cycle to give an explanation. So we start at the top right, where we generate an hypothesis. So we have an hypothesis. Then we design a study to test this hypothesis. Then we collect the data, analyze the data. That's an hypothesis test. And then we interpret the results. Then we write out the results and you publish a paper. So this is a pretty standard empirical cycle. But the problem here is that you don't really know whether all these things took place properly and whether they were done in the right order. So, of course, the publication has a lot of information, but we are not sure that everything in the publication is actually the way it happened. For example, We could go into this empirical cycle again: hypothesis, design a study, and then analyze the data. And then when you come at to the results, you might think, hey, these are not the results I expected. These are not in line with my hypothesis. Okay, well, maybe I go back to the drawing board and use a different statistical analysis, or maybe I remove a variable or add a variable, and then you can do it again. Maybe collect some other data as well, reanalyze the data, and then maybe now you do have an interesting result that you expected beforehand, so to say. Or maybe you don't, and you can try again. So this is basically designing a study based on the results. And this is, of course, not how it should be in science, because you have to let the data speak for itself and not make your research decisions based on what you find. So how does preregistration help with this? Well, this is the place where preregistration comes into the research cycle. And it helps because it fixes your design plan and allows others to inspect that. So now you have the publication, what happened in the end, and you have the plan, what you planned to happen, and you can compare the two. So also other people that are not related to your research directly can inspect this, whether your plan was in line with what you did. And that means that all these strange things, these questionable research practices that you can find in the middle of this circle, these are becoming harder because everybody you can do them, but everybody will be able to see them because the plan is clear and the outcome is clear. So everybody would know that you did this. So the idea is that preregistration prevents this from happening. So and by preventing this from happening, the idea is that it prevents these false positives that can arise when you do these data contingent decisions, and then that the overall literature becomes more balanced and less tainted with these false results. So this is more the rationale in psychology why preregistration is a thing. So this is the why. Now we're slowly going into the how. And I'd like to ask you to go to Menti again. Maybe you're still there. That's probably nice, then you don't have to type in the code again. It's menti.com, and the code is 26193127. So let me also slowly go there. So hopefully you now can see a question where you can, yes, exactly, you do. So what preregistration platforms do you know? So I already gave some of it away. One of them is OSF, obviously. But there's also others. So maybe you know some others as well that you have used or that you've heard others people use. Yeah, Prospero is one. What do the health people use? Maybe also OSF. But this is yeah, this is what I expected, I guess. OSF is really, really big for especially for pre-registrations. And then another question. So what information should be included in a pre-registration? So this is a bit more difficult to answer, maybe. You can answer this based on your experience or based on what maybe you saw other pre-registrations. The hypothesis is, I think, a key one. That's where most of research starts with an hypothesis. But there's way, way, way more details that you can put in a pre-registration. Analysis plan, I see that. Yes. So interestingly, in clinicaltrials.gov, you are not required to add a statistical analysis plan. In a lot of pre-registration templates on OSF, you are. But that's also an interesting difference between these two areas. But the main thing indeed is the experimental design, what our hypotheses are, and how you're going to test these hypotheses, basically. All right. thanks for that information, for the input. Let me go back to the slides. Yeah, indeed. So you already put that in there. The Open Science Framework, OSF.io. It's, I think, the most popular one. It's maintained by the Center for Open Science. It's free and, well, indeed commonly used. And this is how it looks like on the bottom right. And why I think it's really useful is that because you can use all kinds of different templates for all kinds of different study types. So you can have one for qualitative research. So like I said, I developed two of these, one for systematic reviews and one for secondary data analyses. So there's all kinds of study types. And well, for most of them, you have some kind of way to get a template that can prompt you to answer the things that you need to answer, basically. So it's pretty simple. You click on Add New Registration, and in this drop-down menu, you can select the one that's most suitable to you, and then you are given a list of questions to answer. So that's the OSF, but there's also others. So this is a psychology-focused one. This is sciarchives.org, which is a kind of an OSF, but for psychology specifically. It's maintained by the Leibniz Institute for Psychology in Trier. And they also have their own specific pre-registration template, which is really comprehensive. I would recommend it if you're doing a quantitative psychology study. Also free and also worth looking at. But there's many more. So clinicaltrials.gov is one, and there's a lot of options out there. So now a bit to some meta science, meta research about pre-registration. So when is pre-registration as a concept, is it effective for a specific scientific field? So there's three things that I looked at in my research and that I think are key. One is pre-registration producibility. So how producible is your pre-registration? You might notice that it's a pretty similar term compared to reproducibility, which you're maybe familiar with. So that's not an accident. So reproducibility is basically, does the paper have sufficient information for someone else to redo the study? That's what a lot of people see as reproducibility. We use the term producibility to say, hey, is there enough information in the pre-registration for you or maybe someone else to actually do the study in the first place? So to produce the study. So this is basically a step before that. In some, it's how detailed your pre-registration is. Then there's pre-registration publication consistency. So if you compare the pre-registration and the final paper, how aligned are they? So you can have a really big, long pre-registration with a lot of details, which is really producible. But if you then still do all kinds of other things in your actual study, then there's a lot of consistency, and there's still maybe questionable research practices going on. So you need both producibility and consistency. And well, how do we know whether pre-registration works? If you zoom out, well, you can look at the number of positive results in a scientific field. So I told you earlier that a lot of fields are tainted by false positives. And the idea of pre-registration is that it decreases those false positives or prevents those from happening. So if you compare pre-registered studies and non-pre-registered studies, you hope that there's less positive results in the sample of pre-registered studies. So this is how you can maybe track whether pre-registration does its job to a certain extent. So these are three things that we looked at extensively, and I'll give you a short overview of well, some research on these three aspects. So first, producibility in biomedicine. This is a pretty old study, but still holds, where they looked at what's included in the registrations on clinicaltrials.gov. And what they found was that there's important things missing a lot of the time. So I've circled here randomization and blinding. So those things are often not really reported in clinical trial registrations. Well, these are really important things of your research design, of course. And another thing, I also alluded to that a little bit earlier, is that analysis plans are typically not included in those clinical trial registrations. Well, you did mention that as important things in a pre-registration, so that's also a bit of an oversight, I think. Although I think they're trying to correct that now. Consistency in biomedicine. This is a study I've been part of as well, led by Robbie Thibault. And what you can see here is this is a list of things that can be inconsistent between the registration and the publication. So, for example, you can see the analysis or the sample size or eligibility criteria. And circled, you see the percentage of times that these things were inconsistent when they compared registrations and papers. Well, you can see on the whole that the numbers are pretty high. For example, for analysis, almost 50% of the analysis they checked the registration of, it was not aligned with what they actually did or described in the paper. So there's a lot of inconsistencies in biomedicine when it comes to registration. Then there's psychology, also some work on that. This is producibility. And here they looked at pre-registrations in psychology. And there's one interesting finding that I want to share with you. And that is that they found it difficult to even correctly identify the number of hypotheses. So they had two coders, and then one of them found 3 hypotheses, and another found 4. And this happened a lot. So even something so basic as an hypothesis, I think this was the biggest thing you said that should be included in a pre-registration. Even that is sometimes not clearly described. That even people cannot consistently count the number of hypotheses in a pre-registration. So that's quite worrisome, I would say. Consistency in psychology has also been looked at by Aline Klaassen and colleagues. And this is for studies in psychological science that were pre-registered. And they found that only 2 out of 27 contained no deviations. And the most worrying thing is that there were a lot of deviations, but they also went undisclosed. So they found deviations, but they didn't find that authors actually mentioned these deviations. So that is very important. If there's a deviation, you can deviate, but you should always be transparent about this. So we took all this on board, and tried to create a big study combining everything. So we looked at studies from the Open Science Framework, pre-registration studies, and studies that got a pre-registration badge. So sometimes journals can award a pre-registration badge for a study that has a pre-registered study, for a paper that has a pre-registered study. We omitted all kinds of studies as well. So, for example, no studies based on secondary data, because the processes of pre-registration are a bit different. We only focused on psychology. But in the end, we found 429 pre-registered studies from 251 published papers. So this was our sample size. And then we looked at all these things that I mentioned earlier. So producibility, consistency, and the number of positive results. So first, we looked at hypotheses. And we also counted them and identified them. And you can see here that almost 60% of studies contained added hypotheses. So hypotheses that were not there in the pre-registration, that all of a sudden were there in the paper. 50% about also contained omitted hypotheses. So there were some hypotheses in the pre-registration that they were suddenly gone in the paper. And almost 20% of studies also contain changed hypotheses. So, for example, in the pre-registration, they said, okay, we expect a positive association. And then in the paper, they said, okay, yeah, we expected no association between these variables. So I think that one might be the most problematic one. Here's a visual depiction of the changed hypotheses. So they could change also in terms of importance. You can see that on the left. So the left column is what was in the pre-registration, and the right column there is what was in the paper. And you can see that in the purple blob is missing. So these are basically omitted hypotheses. They were suddenly not there in the paper anymore. But you can also see that in a pre-registration, they typically say, hey, this is a primary hypothesis, this is a secondary hypothesis. And in the paper, they sometimes or often do not specify that at all. So it was quite messy, I would say. On the right-hand side, you can see the directions of the hypotheses. So a lot of times the direction was luckily the same, but you can also see that there's, well, you can see a big part missing again, but you can also see that sometimes there were changes. So from a null hypothesis to a non-directional hypothesis, or for a non-directional to a directional hypothesis. And these are pretty important, I would say, because they might be based on what the researchers found, right? So maybe they found this hypothesized, oh, there is going to be a direction, and this is the direction, and they found something, they didn't find something, and then in the paper they said, oh yeah, but we didn't expect to find anything, so it doesn't matter. So this is sometimes what happens, and I have an example of this. So this is what was found in the pre-registration. We do not anticipate that this variable will be significantly associated with that variable. And then in the paper, they said, oh, we anticipate that this variable will show lower accuracy. So they do expect. I'm not sure if someone wanted to say something, but pre-registration, they expect nothing. In the paper, they suddenly expect something. So this is an example of a direction change. Producibility, we also looked at that. So these are three important elements of a study. It should be producible in a pre-registration. Dependent variables, how the data was collected, and the statistical model. Dark green means good. It was described in a lot of detail. Light green means it was described, but not in a lot of detail, so not perfect. Red means it was not there at all, or it was very limited. And gray means it was not applicable. For example, some studies do not have a dependent variable. So in general, this went quite okay. You see a lot of green in there. So when people register, pre-register, dependent variable or data collection procedure, they typically do so well in sufficient detail. So that's a good thing to know. It becomes less positive when we look at consistency. Again, we looked at these three elements. Again, dark green is good, which means they did everything. Everything was in line. So the pre-registration information was exactly the same as the paper information. Red means that this wasn't the case, so it was inconsistent. And the salmon colored means that it was not possible for us to check this in at all. So maybe there was not enough information in pre-registration or not enough information in the paper, but at least we were not able to compare these things because there was not enough information there. Again, gray means that it was not applicable. And here we see a lot of more red, which is bad because that means there is an inconsistency. This is especially pronounced for the data collection procedure. So this also includes the sample size. It was often different in a pre-registration where they said, okay, we want to test 200 people, and they tested maybe 215 or something. And the statistical model, which is also a big one, they sometimes just change that between a pre-registration. Okay, we're going to do an ANOVA with these variables. And then in the paper, they did not ANOVA maybe, but they added covariate, for example. So these are examples of changes, and these were quite frequent. Then finally, we looked at the positive results, which, like I explained, can be a marker of how effective pre-registration actually is in preventing questionable research practices, in preventing false positives. So what we did was we had, well, from our sample, we had a lot of pre-registered studies, but we had to compare those to non-pre-registered studies. So we had to have a comparable sample. So what we did was we looked up all these pre-registered studies, and then we looked at the related records function of Web of Science, and then chose the first one that was not pre-registered. So this is how we were able to compare pre-registered to non-pre-registered studies. And on the right-hand side, you can see what we expected and what we actually found. So we expected that for the pre-registered studies, that the proportion of positive results would go down, right? Because ideally, there will be less false positives, so the number of overall positive results would go down. That's what we expected. We didn't find anything, as you can see on the right-hand side. So we did not find any difference between pre-registered studies and how many positive results and non-pre-registered studies and how many positive results. So basically, we did not find what we expected. So this sheds some doubt on how effective pre-registration currently is, though there are other studies that do show this. So this is a bit of a disclaimer. So to conclude, hypotheses are often inconsistent between the pre-registration and the paper.
Das ist schon uralt, aber nimm die doch mal mit von, oder ich weiß ja nicht.
Could the person who's speaking maybe mute themselves?
So habe ich schon gesagt. Nee,
So there's someone speaking throughout in German.
Sie muss es ja nicht zahlen, wenn sie bei dir wohnt. 25 ja, das ist schon okay. Okay.
I'm not sure if I can
mute
them.
Sozusagen, dass sie an einer Wohneinheit wohnt und genau.
All right, I'll just continue.
Mal reingucken. Na, ich brauche mal deinen Hinweis, ich brauche deinen Rat.
All right, to conclude, hypotheses are often inconsistent between pre-registration and paper, like I showed you. It is hard to compare pre-registration and papers because... Okay, I do need to... Hopefully you can mute people. All right, that did the trick, I think. All right, I'm back. Let me start this slide again. So hypotheses are often inconsistent between pre-registration and paper. I showed that in those graphs. It is hard to compare pre-registrations and papers because a lot of times there was just either in the pre-registration or the paper, there was not enough information. But when information was available, most studies aligned reasonably well. So the consistency was pretty good. Disclaimer here, a lot of inconsistencies were also not transparently reported, which is a problem in and of itself. And finally, pre-registration did not really seem to have the expected effect on the proportion of positive results in the literature. So we expected this discrepancy, but we found similar levels. So what we need to really fulfill the potential of pre-registration, at least in psychology, is better education. So that means what should be in pre-registrations, why should you do it? We need better templates that can really prompt you with questions so that you don't forget certain important things to include them in your pre-registration. And we need better reviews of pre-registration. So what could help, for example, if there is also already a reviewer that looks at your pre-registration. So they don't look at the final paper, but they already look at your pre-registration, so you can make changes there. This could also help in improving the quality of pre-registrations. So this is a concept linked to registered reports, which you might be familiar with. If not, I'll shortly go through it because I think this should be the future of science and the future of pre-registration. So the idea is that you, again, develop an idea, you design a study, then you pre-register. So this is the same, but now there's a peer review process at this stage of pre-registration. So the pre-registration is actually reviewed, you can make changes, and then when it's accepted by the reviewer, then you go on to collect and analyze the data, write the report, and then there's a second stage of peer review, and that only looks at whether you actually did what you set out to do in the pre-registration. So it doesn't really look at details anymore because that's already been done. It only looks at the consistency between pre-registration and paper. And I think this is a really good method because it allows you to make changes when you are still in the development phase of your study. And I think it's also a good way to prevent questionable research practices because it's more out in the open what your plans are. And indeed, there is some research that shows that for registered reports, we do get this expected effect on positive results. Here on the left-hand side, the left column, you see the standard reports. On the right-hand side, you see the registered reports. So this is this mechanism you see at the top. And here you do see that a really big drop in positive results. So the idea here is that because of this process, registered reports, a lot of false positives are not there anymore in the literature. So this is basically my takeaway from my PhD. We should all move to registered reports and maybe do that instead of doing a raw pre-registration. Though also I want to say, I still think that a raw pre-registration is still better than not doing it at all. So this is what I wanted to say. And now I'm going to give you, for the final 20 minutes, let's say 15 minutes, I'm going to give the floor to you to ask questions. You can use Menti for this. And this can be about anything, basically. It can be related to your specific situation, study you have. Could also be more conceptual. I also have some topics that I often get questions about that we can also dive into. But yeah, let's first see what you have to say about this. You should now be able to fill out some questions. So just give you some time, some minutes to think of a question if you have any and formulate it here. Like I said, it can be about anything. Yeah, so there's also a comment in the chat. I think that this has to do with the registered report idea. So they say maybe a downside of registered reports is that if you have the peer review already at the design stage, maybe by external people, that it goes in a direction that you actually did not want. So you have maybe a really specific idea about what you want to study. And if you have a lot of feedback that's maybe changes that somewhat, you maybe don't recognize your project anymore and you don't really want to continue. So yeah, that could be a risk. But I think if you really are clear about what you want to do, I still think it's valuable to get ideas about how you design your study. Simply because some people have different ideas about good processes. All right, so let's get to some questions from Menti. One of them is, do you think you should already write your whole introduction or just the study design? This really depends on your style, I think. I personally do write introductions because it helps me also formulate the research design. So if I write the introduction, I also think about the hypotheses and how the hypotheses came about. And it typically makes me think about things that I did not anticipate previously. So, for example, you dive into the theory behind the hypotheses, and then maybe because of that theory, you make a design change in your study, right? Because maybe the theory or earlier literature says that this happens in some cases, but not in others, and you have to incorporate that into design. And writing an introduction really helps me, at least, in thinking about those things. But this is dependent. I don't think it needs an introduction necessarily, but I think it could have merit. Is there a central hub for choosing the right register? There's not really a register of registers, if you understand what I mean. I think this really just depends on your field. So what is most used in your field? So for psychology and a lot of social sciences, OSF is a big thing. For health research, it's clinicaltrials.gov. Maybe your university or your institute has a repository you can use. I typically recommend Open Science Framework, OSF, simply because they have all these templates that you can choose from. Not all registers have those. I guess it's really field dependent on what you should do. I would always go for the one that's most common in your field, I guess. How to get started with the pre-registration. I think it's basically a matter of just writing up what you are going to do. So a pre-registration sounds pretty formal, right? And there's also meta science about it, like I showed you. But basically, in its basic sense, it's just a Word document with your research design on it. So typically, you already do that for a study, right? You already write on paper what you're going to do. And pre-registration is basically taking the next step to make it public, to have other people that other people can also show it, can also check it out. That's basically what pre-registration is. So just write up and maybe use a template if you're unsure what to include. Science Framework has a lot of them, so there's probably some that fit your need. So I would go check it out there and basically write down what you think you're going to do. I'm just doing the what about scooping first because that's pretty easy. The Open Science Framework, at least, but also other repositories have an option to embargo your pre-registration. So you can basically say, okay, I want to pre-register this now, but I only want it to be visible after I've done data collection. So maybe after 5 months or something, or maybe when I publish the paper after a year. So that way you still have a timestamp on your pre-registration, but it only becomes public later on. So this should prevent scooping. Another thing that I see here is the time it takes for a registered report. And the reviewing may take time, and that is a problem, especially if you're, for example, on a PhD track where you have to do stuff or at least submit stuff within a certain time window. I think that makes things complicated. But if you do not have such a thing, I don't think it is that much longer because yes, there's peer review takes time, of course, but the peer review is now just in the startup phase and not all the way at the end. So if you publish a paper, you also get peer review, right? So that also takes time. So it's just a matter of front loading the peer review time. And I would argue peer review in the beginning makes your study better. And that means that later on, you don't need that much peer review anymore, which makes it perhaps quicker even in the end. But I do see the worries if you have a really fixed time to do this. What's the most complex part of pre-registrations? I think it is because there's always things going different than you planned. So that's, I think, one of the most tricky things. So you cannot foresee everything that is going to happen. So maybe in data collection, some strange things happen, which means you have to rule out half of your participants. Maybe a new analysis method is developed suddenly while you're doing the study that is way more suited to your design. So these are things that can always happen. And it's really tricky to foresee everything. And I want to give you as a takeaway that you do not need to foresee everything. Sure, it is good to have a really comprehensive, producible pre-registration, but it is always possible to deviate from your pre-registration. So this is a misconception that some people have, that you're okay, if you pre-register something, then your design is fixed, and you really have to do everything like you planned. Otherwise, it invalidates your whole study. That is not the case. What is important, if you deviate, it can be for a really good reason. Just write up that reason. Just say, oh yeah, we have to switch this variable because our participants did not understand what we meant by it. So instead, we use now this variable. If you just outline that really clearly, there's no reason for others to invalidate your results because there was a really good reason for you to make this change. So deviations are definitely possible as long as you are transparent about them and why you made these things, these deviations. Exploratory hypotheses. This is also a question I get a lot. So I think for exploratory research, it is less important pre-registration, but I would still recommend it, basically for two reasons. One, it is really good to distinguish between exploratory research and confirmatory research from the start. So if you really say, okay, hey, this is exploratory research, then everybody knows that. And you cannot later say, oh yeah, but it was a confirmatory research after all. So hey, yes, look what we found. We found that our hypothesis was confirmed. So it's really good to start with at least labeling what you're going to do. Are you going to generate hypotheses, or are you trying to confirm hypotheses? That's one reason. Another reason is that pre-registration helps you also think through your design more. So also exploratory studies need a really good research design to be able to extract relevant or useful information, right? And if you write a pre-registration, this forces you to really think through, okay, what can I learn? What design choices can I make to basically maximize my learning? And just thinking about that makes your design already better. This is also what quite some survey research shows, is that people who have pre-registered to experience that their work becomes better simply because they took more time and more effort to think about their research design and their ideas before they actually went in and do it. So I would recommend doing it. It's less important for exploratory research, but I still think it is useful. Where on my CV would I highlight or mention pre-registrations? What I personally do is, if I have a paper which is on there, I just below that I put all the open science things. So I say, this is the paper. I sometimes even do a little description of what we found. Then I have data and materials, and then the OSF link. I have pre-registration, and then the OSF link. So I would just put it near the papers you've written, so that it's really in one glance people can see both the paper and the pre-registration. This also allows people to compare those, which is, I guess, the point of it, right? Should I ask for my supervisor's agreement as a PhD student? So I guess this is to do a pre-registration. Yes. And if they are hesitant about this, you can maybe send them some literature that shows why it is a good idea to pre-register. Feel free to use papers that I wrote, but there's a lot of research out there. There's a good paper by Daniel Lakens about pre-registration, which really shows why it can be really important. And you can also show the Anne Scheel paper, although that's about registered reports. And also, maybe you can just choose the argument that it actually makes sense. It's a normal way of doing science. First, you have a research plan. You really log that, maybe fixate that, and then you do the study. And you shouldn't change your plans based on the results. So that's why it's good to have this plan beforehand and have it out in the open and transparent as possible. So this is really intuitive way. This is also how a lot of master students go about with science, right? If you write your master thesis, you also have to have this whole research plan before you're actually going to do the research. Why would it be different for PhD students or postdocs or even full professors? I think this is the way science should operate typically. Should you already look for a journal after pre-registering, or should you wait until the final results? So this is for registered reports. You really have to submit it to a specific journal that allows registered reports, because the peer review is done at the pre-registration stage, right? So for registered reports, you definitely have to know where you're going to submit it, and then submit it there, and then the peer review takes place. For other journals, it doesn't really matter. I would typically choose journals that are open-minded in terms of pre-registration, that they're not like, oh, what's going on? What is this? Oh, this has a pre-registration. What do I do with it? Luckily, most journals are definitely in the know about what it is and are actually also in favor of it. So I would just, if you have a pre-registered study, I would just look at the journal website, see whether they say something about open science practices and pre-registration, and maybe take that into consideration when you're deciding on where to submit. And then a final question before we have to close the meeting is, for retrospective studies, could pre-registration be done after the request of data from the databases? This is a tricky question. Yes, it is possible, but it is not ideal. there's one thing you really should do when you do this. So this is basically also what a secondary data analysis is. What you really have to do here is clearly outline in your pre-registration when you had access to the data, when you got access, what information you already have about the data. So did you already maybe explore the data a bit? Do you already know what certain variables look like within the data set? This is vital information for others to assess whether you still are blind to the results. Because if you already know the results, there's no point in doing your study, right? Because you already know the answer. That's not what science is. You should be relatively blind to the results, and others can only assess this if you're really transparent about what you know, about your prior knowledge of the database, about the data you're going to use. So this is a really important thing. I would recommend to read my paper about this. It's about secondary data analysis. There's also some other papers that's really informative about this, about what you really should specify about your prior knowledge. But that's the key thing. You can, but it is a bit more tricky. Okay, I think I captured most of the questions. Thank you for these questions. I always like talking about pre-registration and the difficulties of it. If you have any more questions, feel free to email me. My email is ovdakker@gmail.com. You can also just Google my name and you'll find it then. Happy to answer any questions you may still have. Thank you for your attention also.
Yeah, and thank you, Olmo, for a really nice presentation and making this interactive and entertaining and answering all the good questions about pre-registrations. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.